Well, good morning and welcome to this event titled Building Faster to Achieve Net Zero. This is an event that the Bipartisan Policy Center is hosting in concert with our good friends at the Aspen Institute. It is the second in a series of discussions where we are exploring this question of whether there is a new alignment between the imperative for economic recovery, the imperative for community redevelopment, and the imperative for decarbonization that in fact creates a new chance to rethink the way we build things in this country. The need for speed has been the tagline of these conversations, recognizing the complexities involved in citing and permitting new structures in a federalist system and a democracy that has long had control vested at the local level. And so as we think about the scope and scale of this challenge, we are bringing together experts from around the country to think about what is possible. And it's wonderful that we're doing it at this dynamic moment in our national political discussion. In fact, just earlier today, we learned of a new breakthrough in the permitting negotiations happening on Capitol Hill that we have an opportunity to talk about today. So I get to lead off a conversation with two of the leading thinkers in our Congress on this topic, and then I turn it over to my friend, Governor Bobby Jindal, also a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Smarter, Cleaner, Faster Task Force. It is the most superlative task force that we have at the BPC to lead a discussion with some policy experts and dig a little deeper. So let me kick it off by introducing our two panelists. First, Representative Sean Casten, a Democrat representing the western suburbs of Chicago, the great 6th District of Illinois, where my in-laws happen to live, and they are fortunate, Congressman, that you represent people whether they voted for you or not. So they appreciate that very much. But the Congressman serves on the Space, Technology, and Science Committee. He is the Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Entrepreneurship and Capital Markets. He is also a co-chair of the No Democrat Coalition on Climate Change. Joining us from North Dakota, Representative Kelly Armstrong, elected in 2018. As a representative of North Dakota, he gets to represent the whole state, which I know is a great honor and good for his vehicle mileage. He is a lifelong North Dakotan and serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So welcome both. So look, I'm going to just kind of kick this off with the overarching premise that the focus on the challenges of decarbonization have started to change the discussion around permitting. You both served on the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. And so I wonder, maybe starting off with you, Congressman Casten, just talk a little bit about your sense of the role that infrastructure plays in this decarbonization challenge and the extent to which the focus on the scale of that challenge does seem to be changing the dynamics around the permitting modernization conversation.
So thanks so much to be here. Nice to see you virtually, Kelly. Look forward to seeing you next week. And I am always jealous of somebody who doesn't have to worry about redistricting. So I enjoy your single at-large seat. Look, we have this amazing opportunity in front of us right now, and we have this amazing urgency. The opportunity is to invest a ton of capital, a scale of capital that dwarfs anything we can possibly do from the federal balance sheet. If we are to meet the climate goals, we're going to have to electrify substantial parts of our load. We're going to have to decarbonize. The best estimates we've seen is that that's going to take over 1,000 gigawatts of new generation. By the way, we've only got 1,000 right now, and north of $300 billion of new transmission. The most aggressive programs I've seen on an infrastructure package are maybe $100 billion in new transmission. That's fine, because it means that, like everything we've ever done in our infrastructure environment, we need to figure out how to make sure that the private sector has a huge role and the right incentives. And so some of what we're going to do is figuring out how to invest federal dollars. Some of what we've got to do, which strangely is harder, is taking away some of the barriers to private sector capital deployment. And some, but not all of that, gets into permitting, right? It is way easier to permit a gas pipeline than to permit a high voltage transmission line. It's fantastic that Biden has talked about creating a single office of transmission permitting, which is going to be critical to get this done. It's how you get things like the Clean Power Line, like the Sioux Green Line installed. But policy changes like that are not really reconcilable, right? Subject to the Byrd Rule, because they don't require federal dollars. And so I think a lot of the challenge right now is figuring out what is the bipartisan package going to be, and can we get a bipartisan commitment to really unleashing the private sector while prioritizing, climate positive investments And then what's left, on the reconcilable side, be limited to the federal infrastructure piece. And it's a close thing. I don't know the answer to that, but that's where the dynamic is right now.
You are so good. You just teed up my next 6 questions, Congressman. So thank you for that introduction. So Representative Armstrong, you are a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus. I think that there's been and continues to be a very significant debate about regulation and taxes, but there seems to be a coalescing around the notion of innovation investment. And just please share your sense about the role that a significant generational commitment, as the administration described it, investment in infrastructure could do to accelerate our climate compliance.
Well, I think we start with everybody loves infrastructure, but they love it somewhere else. We're counterintuitive. We have that counterintuitive point. I mean, utilitarian infrastructure, whether it's a transmission line, a highway, a cloverleaf, a pipeline, is never popular in the community it's in. That's why we did the FAST Act last Congress. We're working on it again, continue to do it. And I think, listen, regardless of where you're at on any of these things, I mean, we've seen it with transmission lines on the East Coast, from a hydro plant in Canada. We've seen it with pipelines here, but I think it's telling that the hardest thing to get permitted that takes the longest is a highway, particularly if you cross any federal waterway. So regardless of where you're at on the spectrum, we know we need to modernize our grid. We need more infrastructure. We need more transmission infrastructure. North Dakota does wind, oil, coal, natural gas. We do it all. It seems like we can get it in the ground pretty well when it stays in state. When we have to either touch some federal lands in the western part of the state or cross a state line, it drastically slows way down. So I think streamlining the process, allowing for all the environmental things to be taken care of, but also forcing the permitting process into a defined timeline is a really good step to start. Because if we're going to electrify the grid, if we're going to continue to do these things, particularly in rural America, we got to get the infrastructure in the ground. And one of the ways to do that is absolutely streamlining the permitting process. Also think we need some semblance of litigation reform, but that's probably a more complicated conversation for a longer time.
All right, well, baby steps. Let's talk about the fierce urgency of pragmatism. So, Congressman Casten, you were a clean energy entrepreneur, so you bring a wealth of private sector experience to this debate, and you made mention of something that we also at the BPC think is very important, and that is the question of leveraging private capital. Even if we spend a couple $1 trillion of taxpayer money, and I apologize to my children at least once a week, we still have a tremendous obligation to find ways for the public and private sectors to work together. I think the affectionately described BIF, Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, imagines that we could unleash up to $250 billion of private capital if we made some changes that enabled that mechanism to be more successful. So just unpack that a little bit from your experience. What are the types of things that the government could do that would provide an encouragement to private sector investment?
So I got to start by quoting Hamlet. There is more twixt heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophies, Jason. I think there are 2 classes of things that we think about and leverage in the private sector. There are things that are done with intent, right? Public-private partnerships, and we're very good at those. Great green banks, infrastructure banks, and don't get me wrong, we should do all those things, right? Really important. What we never talk about enough is that the U.S. energy industry wouldn't know competition if it bid it in the you-know-what, right? We built out our entire energy infrastructure in this country, either with regulated monopolies for the electric sector, or with de facto monopolies from the oil and gas sector because of the massive capital barriers to entry. And I'm not sure we would have built the energy industry of this country without that, right? Because in general, private capital isn't really fond of capital-intensive industry selling undifferentiated commodity products. Like, there's just a lot of bankruptcies that follow from that approach. However, once that energy system is in place, we have massive barriers to innovation and competition that exist because in Washington, the losers will always cry at twice the volume that the winners cheer. The entrepreneurs who are going to benefit from a more competitive energy system don't exist yet, right? But the folks involved know exactly what they have to lose. So, why is it that I was building in my prior life, I was building power plants that were 2 to 3 times as efficient as the electric grid using 1920s technology. How the heck did markets allow that to happen? And I was getting 2 to 3 year paybacks on it, right? The reason that's allowed to happen is because we have a whole electric sector that earns a return on invested capital, and operating costs are pass-throughs. You distort markets when you do that. You look at countries like Switzerland. Switzerland generates 2.5 times as many dollars of GDP per unit of primary energy use as the United States does. Germany is about the same level. The UK is a little bit less. We convert energy into GDP at about the same rate as Oman, which is to say we have designed our economy to incentivize resource extraction, not resource conversion. That's an enormous opportunity, right? But what would it look like to actually take away those existing barriers, which is the second thing we need to think about. The coal industry in this country, every coal plant causes as much downstream health costs as that. When you look at the asthma rates, the premature mortality, it works out to about 100% subsidy on the coal industry. The downwind costs are about $30 to $50 a megawatt hour, the downwind health costs. So effectively, Medicaid is subsidizing the coal industry in this country. Well, guess what? That hugely slows the deployment of clean energy, right? Because the clean energy sector doesn't bear that. The nuclear industry, they have to pay for their waste disposal. The coal industry gets Medicaid to pay for it. So I think the real big private sector opportunities are how do we take away those existing barriers, or, you know, as I'd like to say, how do we, let's take the emergency brake off this car and hit the gas. And that's how we're really going to unleash private capital.
That is a big frame enthusiasm for energy efficiency and internalizing the full cost of these systems. I want to ask Congressman Armstrong, you mentioned the Fast 41 Act, which is just a pretty common sense thing that's at the same time been very controversial. And I wonder if you can just unpack that a little bit for our viewers. I think most people have some familiarity with it, but you know, what were the ambitions behind Fast 41? Why has it been controversial? And can you share anything about this? You know, what we're hearing reporting of some progress, at least on the Senate side of the aisle.
Well, I'm hopeful for the progress, and Representative Caston quotes Hamlet. I'll quote Field of Dreams: "If you build it, they will come." And I think that's a huge part to help in this. I think so the bill we had, and hearing what we're hearing, is it gets rid of the 7-year sunset. A lot of the controversy is about the day-to-day operations. I know that's been a lot of the conversation, trying to get that cleaned up. And I'm going to shock everybody here, but I agree. I just think I agree with Representative Caston, particularly in how we regulate these markets and how the infrastructure exists. But I also think we have to be able to deal with how we're going to deal with power in the interim and doing these things. And the easiest place to start, right, is the grid and all of that. But with the Permitting Improvement Council, I mean, bringing agencies to start the permitting process and some of the largest things and getting them done, or at least telling us why you can't get it done in 2 years. There's, like I said, a highway is the hardest thing to cross on a waterway. You know, you have the nationwide Permit 12 Corps of Engineers. We've seen this in North Dakota on the bottlenecks. If you go down Highway 85 in Western North Dakota, you're coming off the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, touching the man-made Lake Sakakawea right next to a state park. There isn't an alphabet soup agency that isn't involved in that, from BIA to Forest Service to Park Service to Interior to EPA to Corps of Engineers. And that's just on one little stretch in North Dakota. And I think that's the important part when we're talking about the FAST Act and the permitting. It's not everywhere, but it's the bottlenecks that can often slow that down. And those bottlenecks exist when you're trying to do these large infrastructure projects. So I hope they solve some of the operational issues in the sunset part of it. And because I think the concept's really important for getting a modernized grid in place. It just is. I mean, whether it's private capital, public capital, all these partnerships, if it's taking you 12, 13 years to get a project in the ground, one, it's more expensive to build. Two, it's just less attractive to capital investment.
So the point you're making about political risk, we heard a lot. One of the main barriers to private investment is just the fear that you'll have an election between the time the project is actually permitted and built and something might change. But I want to ask you a follow-up on Fast 41.
We've seen that with 2 pipelines, one in Montana, one in North Dakota. So
fair. You talked about the fact that Fast 41 will just provide a little bit of a more clarity around roles and responsibilities and expectations. One of the other critiques that comes up a lot is that we simply don't have the resources in the system to handle the workload. And particularly if we imagine having to double, triple, or quadruple the pace of infrastructure turnover, what's your thought, as a good conservative Republican, about once we get the rules improved, having resources going to the agencies to make sure they can handle the flow of the work?
Well, I think that's absolutely important, but I also think, and this is something we're really bad at the federal level, particularly in the regulatory agency, if you have to provide something to Interior, EPA, and the Forest Service, they're all asking for the same thing, but they all ask for it in a little different form. So the cost of compliance and the cost of regulatory regime is spread out about 3 agencies, and you're talking about duplicative, burdensome process. So part of what I hope they do when we get this in place is figure out a way to streamline this. So if you're providing the information, you're providing it. It also has the added benefit, which I think is accurate. If you're asking for something in a little different form each time, that difference is where plaintiffs' lawyers make their living, right? And if you care about prairie chicken habitat, you don't care what's bifurcating it. You just care that it's being bifurcated. So one of the ways to, I think, really streamline this on both ends is cut down the amount of paperwork you're providing. And yes, we should provide the resources, but hopefully we can centrally locate this. And that's what the whole thing about Fast 41 is. So we're not deploying resources to every single regulatory agency and making it duplicative and burdensome.
My kid just got into college, thank goodness. She'll be moving out of the basement, but the universal application was a big benefit to the family. So maybe there's an analogy there.
And by the way, we know how to do this, right? We do it with spills. We wish we would never have spills, but it's almost like incident command, right? If you have a pipeline spill, whoever reports first on scene is kind of who you deal with until they trade it off. We just don't do it on the front end as well.
That's a good point. So Congressman Casson, you participated in the Aspen-led working group that the Bipartisan Policy Center also enjoyed, which came out with, I think, a really thoughtful set of recommendations, a little disruptive, some big ambition, thinking long-term about what would be necessary to create kind of a political system that could tolerate the success of the scale of change that's going to be necessary. I think we were just talking about Fast 41, which is, I think, fairly described as some very important incremental progress. But can you talk a little bit about the Aspen process and what you thought were some of the more constructively disruptive ideas that were put into the discussion there?
So at first, I feel like I have to channel Jim Connaughton, who always reminded us that these are what's the word, charrette rules. We don't talk about what happens at Fight Club. What I thought was really there was a bunch of really good permitting stuff. The idea of having pre-approved transmission corridors across federal land that will be pre-approved for certain types of generation, so that now you could have developers come and say, okay, these corridors I know where the resources are, let me plan with the assumption that that's largely locked into place. Really good stuff. Streamlining the interconnection queue and prioritizing certain types of resources, both to make sure that those resources come to ground and also to get rid of, let's be honest, some of the gaming that goes on when people jam people who have a vested interest in maintaining congestion at their node might jam that queue. So, I think there was some really good, creative, very bipartisan stuff that came out of there. And again, I'm focused on the transmission side, but mostly because I think the single bottleneck to getting where we need to get to on climate is ultimately paced by electric transmission. I had this conversation recently with Mr. DeFazio that they've got this, I think, a pretty great transportation infrastructure package they've just come out with, and it's got a huge amount of stuff for electric vehicle charging, which consumers are going to like, users are going to like. Speaking as an electric vehicle owner, they're really fun to drive. Like, it doesn't matter what you like, what your environmental goals are. But we got done, and I said, okay, so we're building, to electrify the vehicle fleet, we need to, build multiple hundreds of gigawatts of new generation, and we're going to have to connect it to loads in locations that don't currently exist. We're going to need a lot of wires, right? That's what PACE is, and we got to figure out how to build that. I do just want to comment on just your comment about, and I think I'm agreeing with Kelly on this. I think we consistently understate how quickly the private sector can move. The New Deal electrified 80% of rural America in a decade. The 92 Energy Policy Act and FERC 888 that for the first time in our history gave an incentive for generators to deploy low-cost generation, led to 200,000 megawatts of combined cycle being built in 10 years. Let's not be constrained by our ambition. Like, yes, we do need to scale up, but every time we have made these kind of transformative changes to our energy system, it has proved to be vastly easier than we thought it would be.
Appreciate and embrace that optimism, because 2050 is not that far away when you're trying to build energy systems. Representative Armstrong, we talked a lot about transmission, and North Dakota's got a lot of wind, and I think we've thought about that. The administration's focused on that, but there's also a lot to do when it comes to carbon management. We're very focused on direct air capture and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We have a tremendous infrastructure right now to move liquid fuels through this country that is not going away in the next several years. Talk a little bit about your imagination for how that infrastructure might be purposed, or what kinds of infrastructure we'll need for CO2 pipelines and sequestration wells, and how that fits into this larger discussion about the permitting and siting process.
Well, and I appreciate the question because, and I agree. I mean, we've been in North Dakota. We had the Bakken shale boom starting in 2008, right? So we've figured out how fast we're good at producing energy. And I mean, we talk about oil, coal, and natural gas a lot in North Dakota, but we have a ton of wind as well. But I don't think you can sacrifice the future or the present in order for the future. And I don't think they're counterintuitive, and I don't think they're necessarily competing. We're lucky. We're one of 2 states in the country with primacy on carbon capture. We just had a coal plant that was sold that's going to deploy coal, natural gas, wind energy onto the GRE line that goes into Minnesota because consumers are demanding that. But 45Q is important. I mean, pipeline infrastructure is important. Being able to use it for enhanced oil recovery is going to be important as we move forward. And these companies are going to continue to develop cleaner and better energy, but also at the same time, we have to fuel our economy while we're getting to that point. And we have those available resources, and we want to produce all of those things cleaner as well. So I think, as we move forward, there's picking winners and losers in transmission is going to be interesting. You've seen that with the Permit 12 of the Corps of Engineers and how they're starting to rewrite the rule based on energy source. But at the same time, we can't get away from what is actually being utilized. I mean, listen, we're talking about heat waves, and there's, terrible, terrible things. But when it's 25 below for 28 days straight in North Dakota, resilient and reliable energy is important. And we can get cleaner, but we have to do it in a way that allows us to utilize what we have now. And carbon capture, CO2, and 45Q and enhanced oil recovery is going to be a part of that. It has to be.
All right, we got time for 1 or 2 more questions before I turn it over to Governor Jindal. And Rep. Cass, I want to talk a little bit about disadvantaged communities, environmental justice, something you and I have had a chance to think about before. I think this is a slight simplification, but for a long time, the permitting process has been seen as an opportunity to slow down threats. There's been a clear history of energy infrastructure and the kinds of things, as Armstrong mentioned, people don't really love to have, being visited upon communities that don't have political power. And so I think the permitting process was seen as a way to slow some of that down. Now, all of a sudden, there's a focus on the opportunity to speed up good things. The administration has made a general commitment that a significant fraction of the new infrastructure investments will be directed towards historically disadvantaged communities. How do you see this debate changing, and what's the opportunity to get local communities more engaged in the ambition to speed things up rather than the anxiety to slow things down?
So I think we need to separate. We need to bifurcate environmental justice into 2 separate groups. There are the groups of people who have historically been disadvantaged by dirty energy. And then there are the groups of people who are going to be disadvantaged by the conversion to clean energy. They're 2 very different groups, and we have to factor both of them in. I think in some ways that first group is the easier problem. And they're the easier problem because anything we do to invest in clean energy makes energy cheaper and makes the air cleaner, and whether that's investing in energy efficiency or heat pumps in your home or zero marginal cost renewable generation on the grid, or even going from simple cycle gas turbines to combined cycle, or increasing the capacity factor of nuclear plants. All of these things lower the marginal cost of keeping your beer cold. right? And do so in a way that doesn't create as much pollution. It's the wonderful thing about getting more with fewer inputs. And so those problems, I think, are solvable. And part of the reason why you're seeing more, the permitting issue is easier, because it's the building a permit that's going to allow you to connect transmission to an inner city community that allows the coal plant to be shut down. It's a win-win-win-win-win, right? Everybody benefits from that. Now, there are some issues that I think we're still grappling with. How do we electrify our vehicle fleet and make sure that folks who don't own their own house and don't have a garage still have a charging infrastructure that's available to them near where they park their car? And we're working on that. But we have to keep a lens on that. The harder part to deal with, and we have to deal with it, is what do you do with the people who are disadvantaged? Because this conversion, and we've already seen it in lots of parts of the country, presents a massive wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers, right? And the fact that it is now cheaper to generate energy from clean sources means that, largely explains why ExxonMobil wrote off $20 billion last year. It explains why Wells Fargo wrote off $100 million of their portfolio. It explains why the unconventional oil and gas sector blew through $340 billion of free cash flow over the last decade. It's not because they're bad people. It's because they are producing a product that cannot compete against the stuff that's coming up behind it. And so what do we do for those communities that have historically depended on energy production? And I would submit to you that I think at core, that is the bipartisan challenge. Because if you divide the country up into the parts of the country where energy consumers are, e.g. where people live, and the places where we produce energy, AKA the big wide open spaces where there aren't as many people and it's easier to permit things, you got something that looks an awful lot like a red-blue map of the country, right? And that causes us to view it through a partisan lens, but I think it's this question of what do we owe to citizens of this country and what do we owe to the communities that they live in? And that is a hard problem, but we've got to deal with it head on, because I think if we can solve that, we've got a way that whether you represent, the suburbs of Chicago like I do, or North Dakota, or rural West Virginia, we all represent Americans, right? And I think if we can acknowledge that you losing $100 and me gaining 1,000 is a net gain to society, but it doesn't mean you're going to root for it. Right?
I think it's a really, really thoughtful frame. I'll just, commercial announcement, we'll be having a discussion later this afternoon with Congressman McKinley and Schrader, who have put together a bipartisan energy bill to try to decarbonize the power sector, very focused on that question about how do we make sure all communities are part of that solution. So I think you are exactly right. I think that is the bipartisan challenge. Final question, I think, over to you, Rep. Armstrong, and it's an unfair one, but how's this BIF going to work? We going to get this, infrastructure is the best idea that never happens. They haven't blown it yet, right? The White House fumbled a little and then they dove on the fumble, and now they're advocating, I think, quite forcefully. We going to pull this off?
Well, it's been infrastructure week for my entire 2.5 years in Congress. So, no, listen, outside of the actual, workings for it, I think the city needs it. We need it in government. The country needs it. It happens to be infrastructure. It happens to be bipartisan. I think I'm really hopeful we can keep moving forward. I'd like to get it done sooner rather than later. We bleed into even years and politics gets even more involved than it does right now. But I just want to end with saying I really appreciate what Sean just said, because a lot of times when we talk about renewable jobs versus coal jobs or oil jobs, and listen, we all are in one country and we have all of that, but I'm just telling you, if you take 260 coal miners in Beulah, North Dakota, and spread those 260 jobs out around the rest of the country, nothing scales up like oil and gas or coal in these communities. And it's important to remember when we do it, that it's personal, it's familial, it's generational, and it's really, really parochial. And that's where we get into a lot of those issues. And it's true. So acknowledging that, I would say our new Secretary of Commerce has been great on these issues, at least having these conversations and having it like like this is important because there are people in my state, in the middle of the state, that feel like they are completely forgotten in this conversation, and they don't necessarily want to move to go have a clean energy job in the Panhandle in Florida. Their families lived in Central North Dakota their whole life. But I'm excited about a potential for an energy or infrastructure deal. It's not dead yet, and as long as we keep hearing that, we're going to be good to go.
Well, I want to thank you both. I think not only substantively, but just the kind of the spirit that you bring to this conversation is in fact what gives me confidence that we are going to pull this off. And when we come back to this very difficult question about what is a dignified transition for this country writ large towards the new economy, we're going to be looking to both of you for more guidance. So I want to thank you both. Have a great, I guess today's Wednesday or Thursday. I've lost track. It's the pandemic still. Thank you.
And just to close on a bipartisan note, I want to emphasize that, Kelly, I also do not want to move to the Florida Panhandle. So we will, and I'll tee that up for your next speaker to talk about the charms of that particular region.
As I said, a perfect transition to a leader of the Gulf Coast United States. Thank you, Congressman, both. My pleasure now to turn this over to friend and partner, Governor Bobby Jindal. Governor Jindal, as I think most of you know, was governor of Louisiana from 2008 to 2016. He also was a thought leader in the Republican Party and chaired the Republican Governors Association. He represented the 1st District of Louisiana in the Congress of the United States. I'd say probably most important in his entire career, he is now a leading light on the BPC's Smarter, Cleaner, Faster Permitting Task Force. And he is going to lead this second half of the discussion today. So, Governor, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. Let me start off by inviting all of your viewers and our congressmen to come visit. We call it Redneck Riviera down here. They'll love the beaches. They don't have to move. I represented Louisiana, not the Panhandle of Florida, but we got some beautiful coast and great people and great food down here. Thank you, Jason. That was a great panel. We all learned a lot. I think listening to the policymakers, the congressmen, one from each side of the aisle, talking about the policy challenges. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to actually talk to the folks that actually have to build this infrastructure, actually have to build this generation, this transmission capacity. And so before we launch into this next segment, I'm going to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves. We're first joined by J.C. Sandberg. He's the Chief Advocacy Officer at the American Clean Power Association. He has an extensive background in the private sector. He comes to ACP from GE Renewable Energy. Our second panelist and our guest today, our second speaker, Alex Glenn, Senior Vice President, Chief Executive Officer for Duke Energy, Florida and the Midwestern regions. Duke Energy, as many of our viewers know, is a Fortune 150 company, a large, important power generating utility company. And Alex has spent much of his career with that company. Let me ask JC and Alex, before we get into our questions, let me ask them to quickly introduce themselves. JC?
Thank you, Governor. It's my privilege to be here today with you and to Jason and the group for organizing this important discussion. As the governor said, I joined the ACP, the American Clean Power Association, from General Electric. And we are very excited about this opportunity that's presenting itself in the Congress, both with this infrastructure package and a possible reconciliation package. And I think this is a very important discussion we have today about how we, as both as a country and as an industry, can help push forward the permitting and other things necessary to get more of these projects in the ground.
Thank you. Alex?
Thank you, Governor. I couldn't agree more with one thing that Representative Caston said, is that we've got an amazing opportunity and a keen sense of urgency on these issues today. We really are at an inflection point in our history with the energy grid and with transforming our production of energy and the transmission of that, and providing customers more and more options. And so the bipartisan effort here is critically important. If we can keep that momentum going, we will really transform the nation, and it's a wonderful opportunity.
I couldn't agree with you both. And let me invite our viewers to please send us your questions. We've got some questions already that we'll start with, but please do send us your questions if you'd like either panelist to address these. Now, look, from my perspective, it's pretty simple. We have to build a lot more generation and transmission capacity than we built historically. and we've got to do it more quickly and more cost effectively than we've done. And really, it's too expensive and takes too long to build projects in America compared to the countries we compete with all over the world and right next door. You look at what our experience is versus Canada, much less countries overseas. And that's really the theme of what we're talking about today. And JC, I'll start with you. I know you guys are really involved in decarbonizing the grid to help us achieve our climate goals. Let's start with power generation. The reality is that I think everybody agrees we're going to have to get significant amount of new energy generation online to make sure that Americans continue to have access to affordable and reliable energy. I mean, regardless of your political background, it's absolutely essential for our quality of life, for economic growth. And so I'd be curious, I think our viewers would be curious to know what kind of generation projects are you looking at, and where do you see permitting challenges to building more capacity even more quickly?
So, Governor, I appreciate that question. And I think if we look at the president's proposal of 100% clean energy by 2035, we would have to double or triple the installation of wind and solar to make that a reality. And what comes with that is the transmission and other things. And I think across our industry's generation sources, be it wind, onshore or offshore, be it solar, the kind of influx of storage options that are now a part of the discussion as well as we install these projects, those are all beholden to one thing, and that is permitting. And so I think if we separate those out, and the federal intervention in that, I think at times has been slow, especially as we look at some of the offshore examples. It could be streamlined and faster. And we've put out some discussion points. I think there was some discussion before about whether it's time limiting NEPA or EAs, whether it's page limits on certain things, whether it's the expanded use in the appropriate ways of categorical exclusions in some of these things. I think they're all of a flavor of things that can be done while we still protect the environment, but also incentivize and push forward these projects in a more timely fashion.
Hey, look, you raised several good points that our task force absolutely addressed and agrees with you on. I do want to come back to you in a couple of minutes about categorical exclusions. That's something we wrote about, so I'd love to hear more about that. I couldn't agree with you more about time limits for regulatory action as well. But in the meantime, let's switch gears a little bit. Alex, we talk a lot about power generation, and that's clearly critical, but I don't think there's been enough focus on transmission. I think maybe after what happened in Texas, there was a little bit more focus on transmission than there has been. But I've heard, I'm not an expert in this area, but I've heard that we might need to triple our current transmission grid by 2050. And I don't know that people realize what an amazing challenge that is. I know down here in Louisiana during hurricanes, we become well aware of how reliant we are on a handful of critical transmission lines. I remember during Gustav and Ike, a couple of, we learned how much of the power to New Orleans all depended on just a couple of choke points. And if those went down, how long it would take to rebuild even that infrastructure temporarily. So can you talk a little bit about why transmission is so important and the challenges that you see in siting and permitting that new transmission and any potential solutions to speed that process up?
Yeah, it's a great question, Governor. And to give you some perspective about the type of production that we're going to need at Duke Energy, for example, and what that means for transmission on the grid. So right
Well, as often happens, we've got a little bit of a technical glitch. We'll come back to Alex in a second. Anybody that's been subject to Zoom meetings at home knows this can happen. And so we're going to roll with the punches. We'll come back to the transmission question because I think he was in the middle of making a great point. Jason, I think Alex is back. Alex, you froze for a second. So if you could start your answer again for us, please. About
okay. Yeah. Can you hear me? I apologize for the bad connection.
That's okay.
Yeah. So to give the magnitude of the issue,
all right, well, we're going to move on with Jason. We'll come back when Alex reestablishes his connection. Like I was saying, anybody that's had to do Zoom meetings for work or school knows this happens.
With transmission, you got to get production.
All right, so JC, we'll wait on Alex, but in the meantime, let's move on. Look, there have been calls to help increase the siting of clean power generation by using public lands. And I want you to expand a little bit. What opportunity do you think we have to put clean power on public lands? What are the unique permitting challenges, and what do you think are the paths to overcoming those challenges? I mean, is that a practical way for us to expedite this process, or what are the unique challenges with using public lands?
Well, I certainly think it presents Governor a tremendous opportunity. I think there are various facts and figures out there. Excuse me, one of the other blessings of digital. I think, maybe we use about 1% of what's the capacity for wind and about 6% for solar. So there's tremendous opportunity out there, but I do think there can be things that can be done as part of this to make these available resources onshore more easily accessible and maybe designated for renewable development. I think there's also, coordinating, and maybe this will lead in a little bit into your transmission question, is how do we coordinate the land use planning for deployment of renewables, but also the siting of transmission to evacuate the power. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity. I think that things like Fast 41, some of these other permitting things we've talked about that can speed up the process in a responsible environmental way can really help us get and jumpstart the deployment of renewables on federal land.
Well, it looks like Alex is back with us. Alex, shot at that transmission question. We just lost you for a second. So if you want to start.
Yeah, my apologies. My apologies. Yeah, so the transmission that we're going to need to get out of coal, which will be the largest in the industry of coal retirements across our fleet, we're going to have to increase the number of megawatts of renewable energy, solar and wind, from 3,000 megawatts that we have on now to 47,000 megawatts to achieve our net zero goal. You think about that, that's covering the District of Columbia with solar 20 times over. And so much of that, as JC said, is not near the load source. And so the geographies are different. It's going to require a lot of transmission. Offshore wind in North Carolina can be a fabulous resource. We've got to get that transmission and got to get that wind to customers in an affordable manner. And that's going to be critically important. And I think one of the statements that Representative Armstrong made is that, everybody loves infrastructure, of course, but not near them. And so how do we do that across states is going to be critically important for us to get the renewables into our service territories, whether it's Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Florida, or the Carolinas. And so we've got to really tackle that issue if we're going to get cheap renewable energy to the load sources.
I think that's a great point. So Louisiana, our Gulf Coast has historically been a great source of oil and natural gas for the rest of the country, even parts of the rest of the world. And there's an opportunity to generate wind there, but you're exactly right. Without the transmission lines to get that energy that's generated to the end use customers, that wind could end up being stranded, and it won't have the economic and the energy impact everybody would like to see. But again, something that probably doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. We talk a lot about generation, but transmission is going to take significant investment, and it's going to, and you're right, the NIMBY concerns. We're going to have to figure out the permitting process to build more transmission capacity than we've done historically, much more quickly, and much more cost effectively. JC, I told you I was going to come back to this. You had mentioned in your first question, your first answer, the use of categorical exclusions. That was actually a recommendation we put in our Stronger, Cleaner, Faster Infrastructure Task Force. And yes, that was a plug for the task force's recommendations. You can go online and read those on the Bipartisan Policy Center's website. Could you talk a little bit more about what that means? And if you have examples of things that would be helpful in real life. It's great to have these task force recommendations. You guys are on the front line seeing how this stuff is being used every day. Explain to folks what we mean about categorical exclusions and how this could be actually helpful to folks out there that are actually having to build this capacity and then ultimately build these transmission lines.
So, Governor, as you know, the categorical exclusion process is for things that have known and minimal environmental impacts, right? So, and I think a more consistent application of the categorical exclusion process across the federal family is something that I think would bring real benefit to this. And so you asked for some specific examples, and I would say, one of those we'll give two. I think one on the wind side and one on the solar side. So for the onshore and offshore wind side, we fly these what we call MET masts, right? So a stationary thing that collects wind data, and that all goes into the financing of these projects. For Duke or for anybody else, that you have to know what the wind's going to generate. And so onshore, offshore, those things are just a part of the process, and they're always the same, and they have very minimal environmental impact. So could there be some kind of expansion of a categorical exclusion process across that METMAS process? I think another thing is, they're currently the solar categorical exclusion is based on the acreage. I think the number is 10 acres, but could you do that to more than acres? Could you do it to the size of generation, whether it was 100 or 200 megawatt projects? Those are similarly situated. They have similar impacts, environmental impacts. Could you do the categorical exclusion process differently, and rather than acreage, focus on size of the project? And I think those would be two examples where we'd be happy to discuss those further with you or others, about kind of just two ideas, I think, that would help illustrate the categorical exclusion process and how we could expand it.
That's great. And you're consistent with the task force, and we'd love to get more examples and details from you as the committee, as our task force continues our work. One consistent theme you see from the task force's work is trying to identify not only ways to streamline the regulations, but to figure out if there are ways to do this planning on the front end of the process. So, for example, categorical exclusions, it may be that states pre-permit, places, within their borders, sites that are pre-permitted and for these types of clean energy activities, so that developers are ready to go. And so we've got. Let me turn to you, Alex. When we talk, look, I'm a conservative Republican, so obviously, I listening about deregulation and streamlining, federal paperwork, that all sounds great to me. My background's in healthcare. I think that's there's a lot of unnecessary paperwork and delays and costs added by government, but people rightfully have concerns that, hey, while we're talking about this, we do need to move faster. They want to make sure that the process actually protects the environment, that there's opportunities for local input, something that's also obviously very important to me as a former governor, not just a former federal official. And of course, folks are worried about environmental justice considerations. So could you talk to us a little bit about, this is obviously a very important topic. We spent quite a bit of time on this as a task force. Could you spend a little bit of time sharing with us, how do we accomplish all these goals at the same time? Help reassure people that faster, more efficient permitting and construction doesn't have to come at the expense of environmental protections, environmental justice protections and local input. Talk to folks how we balance those concerns.
Well, I think you have to put stakeholder engagement at the forefront. We have to have an honest discussion with all stakeholders to get their input, to make sure that they're heard and that their input is acted upon. And so that's going to be critically important in any infrastructure project. And that's incumbent upon the developer. It's incumbent upon us as a utility. It's incumbent upon us as folks who are protecting the environment as well. And so that's going to be critically important. Although there are places where you can not take huge leaps, but at least put time parameters on and the type of information that's needed in the permitting process. And that would perform, giving the utility, giving the developer more certainty before they're going to deploy billions of dollars of capital at risk, because these projects, delay means death to these projects in many ways, and they won't get cited. So I would say stakeholder engagement, which government, the public and private sector can help with. And that's critically important. And when you talk about categorical exclusions, for example, we have transmission lines that go through federal lands that we need to trim. We have to go through an EA and then potentially an EIS to trim trees that could, fall into the lines. And so that's just one area where we can really make a big difference in reliability and affordability to our customers.
Right. Again, I think that the consistent theme there is the more we do on the front end, the more outreach we do to communities and gather input on the front end, fewer problems we should have on the back end. When I talk to developers and the private investors that were referenced in the last panel, what they're looking for is regulatory predictability and certainty. What they want to know is, are there going to be unexpected delays or cost increases? They'd much rather know upfront how long this process is that they're committing themselves to. And I think that the responsible developers and companies will and welcome that community engagement, but they also want to know what they're signing up for before they start these big projects. Let me ask this question to both of you. The last panel talked about Fast 41, the fact that it's expiring soon, but we got some good news. It seems like there is some real progress on the Hill. There's potentially a deal to include the reauthorization in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Nothing's done until it's done. I was in Congress and I worked in an administration, so I certainly know that you can get to the 1 yard line several times before you actually get something accomplished. But certainly a very good development, as recently as today about a potential bipartisan agreement on that. I'd ask you guys, how important is the permitting council? How important is the dashboard? Are there ways to improve it? I throw that up to both the JC, Alex, both of you, whoever wants to take that first.
Well, I would say from a clean energy perspective, I think, Governor, it's how do we ensure that this council meets its intended purpose for clean energy, right? And it got a ton of attention around the highway portion and some other things. And there were, listed projects on there for offshore and others. But I think, how do we make sure that those requirements and the requirements of the council and eligibility requirements promote clean energy and clean energy projects? And then there was, to get the predictability that Alex talked about, right? Timely and predictable are two buzzwords, I mean, for the most effective allocation of capital. And that's what our member companies are looking for across the spectrum. And I think the other piece is, there was a little bit of discussion, I think Jason asked the question of the folks this morning, or there was some discussion about resourcing. How do we ensure that there's adequate resources at these agencies, including this council and the other federal agencies that participate, to actually do the work? And I think those are two important pieces. One is making sure that the clean energy stuff is in and prioritized and promoted. And then how do we allocate resources at a federal level to make sure that there are the human capital element to actually process the permits?
It's one of the few times you actually see companies willing and voluntarily wanting to pay user fees to expedite this process, in many cases, not every case. Alex, your thoughts on that same question?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of steps we can take, meaningful steps. I think expanding access to projects below $200 million, as well as any clean energy project, including transmission on public lands, that would be, I think, very helpful. I think, as JC said, establishing timelines, not only for permits and approvals, but for interim milestones for the application review, information, data requirements, and public engagement. And then I think establishing a dedicated staff that can either issue permits, approvals, or facilitate the issuance of permits. And I think the dashboard is critically important for transparency across all the agencies.
We got one more question. I'm going to ask both of you, and let me remind our audience, please remember you can submit questions either via chat on Twitter, using BPC Live, that hashtag, or you can tweet at us at BPC_bipartisan. So we'd love to get your thoughts and questions for our panelists. We've got a few more minutes with them, and so please do send us your thoughts and questions. I've got some additional questions. We'll continue to run through those as we get audience questions as well. This question is also for both of you. We spent a lot of time talking about the problems and some of the solutions. Oh, I do want to say, Alex, you said something I agreed with. I want to make sure that I said this as well. We're talking a lot about the need to streamline regulations and the permitting process in the context of needing to build new green energy projects, which is absolutely right. We do need more energy capacity, more transmission. However, I think these are also illustrating reforms that should happen in the permitting and regulatory process, just in terms of building infrastructure in general. We heard from the last panel how the delays in building roads and the delays in just building regular infrastructure. The Congress and the White House are talking about a very big, large infrastructure. They joke about being infrastructure week every week, but they're talking. It seems like there's movement on a potential bipartisan deal to spend over $1 trillion on roads and ports, bridges, and other traditionally defined types of infrastructure. It's incumbent upon us to take these best practices and apply it to that kind of infrastructure as well. It's taxpayer dollars, but not only that, we all live in communities waiting for these projects. It shouldn't cost more. It shouldn't take longer to build projects in America than it does in other countries. That wasn't always the case. And so to make sure we're getting the best bang for our dollars and modernizing our infrastructure, many of the lessons we're talking about here about green energy also should be applied to infrastructure projects in general. And Alex, I appreciate your bringing up that point. So one question again for both of you. Again, we've spent a lot of time talking about problems and solutions. I want to give you this is kind of the open-ended question before we go to some more specific questions from our audience. This is, the task force, we spend a lot of time thinking about this. We got some great members, but you guys are on the front lines. As I said in introducing this panel, you guys are the builders. What other solutions should we be thinking about? What other things should we be recommending to Congress and the administration? And JC, I'll turn to you first, and then Alex, I'll come to you. And that question's intentionally broad and open, so please feel free to take it wherever you'd like in terms of this is your chance. What should we be including in our recommendations?
Well, I think we spent a lot of time talking about transmission, and I think you heard Representative Caston and Representative Armstrong talk a little bit about this. I think that is a constraint, and it is increasingly a constraint as we build out, and Alex and the industry builds out more renewable projects. And so getting that stuff to load is important. And I think that there are some opportunities as we go into this bipartisan infrastructure package. There are a bunch of transmission pieces that are in that package, I think, that are critically important. Some interregional planning changes, there's some anchor tenant legislation, some things that are maybe a little more controversial with the backstop siting authority. I think those kind of are the seeds that are germinating that really can push this stuff forward. And I think in the near term, and I think that if we're going to start someplace, that's a good place for us to start. And I think there's an honest discussion happening right now. And I think those are some of the things that can really help break through some of the transmission constraints that we're seeing in the marketplace.
Your thoughts?
I think not just transmission, but I think on the production side, I think we really can use help from the federal government with the private sector. If we're going to reach net zero faster, we're going to need new technologies, and we're going to need better storage technologies quicker. We're going to need to add 11,000 megawatts of additional energy storage on our system by 2050 if we're going to meet our net zero goals.
I think that Alex may have frozen again. He was making an excellent point. I'm going to segue from the point he was making. We actually have a question from Casey Hughes. Thank you for this question, asking, building what Alex just said, isn't battery storage an important part of the solution as well as transmission? I think that's exactly right. Alex, I'm sorry you froze there, but we actually got a question in the meantime, building on what you were saying. Casey Hughes asked, isn't battery storage an important part of the solution as well as transmission? We talked a lot about transmission today. Casey's asking about battery storage. Let me ask you, I will go back to you and you can address that question as you were finishing your comments, and then JC, I'll ask you to comment on that as well. So Alex, you can finish what you were saying. I think we might have lost Alex again. All right, JC, I'll turn to you. Talk to us about battery storage and how important that is in these conversations.
I think batteries play a critical role in this, and I think I'm guessing that's what Alex was going to say. I think as the duration of the storage solution gets longer in a more cost-effective way, I think will continue to play an even greater role. And I think that as the storage and batteries come down the cost curve, they definitely have a place in this for kind of being able to deliver more reliable, firm, green electrons, for lack of a better term.
I think this is going to be one of the biggest technological challenges, to make sure that they're scalable, they're affordable. The technology's got to match and catch up with our policy aspirations. Alex, you're back with us. If you want to finish your thought as well.
I think critically important is energy storage. That's going to be transformative, and it's going to be required. And so we're obligated to provide reliable service 24 hours a day, 365 days a week. And so storage will help the intermittency of renewable resources. And that's got to be a game changer. And because we're seeing it in whether it's California, whether it's Texas and other locations of reliability issues. And we're going to need that technological leap. And that's one area that the federal government can really assist on, working with people in JC's organization and those companies, the utility industry, and the best and brightest in the universities.
That's great. Look, so we've got just 2-3 more minutes left in our panel discussion. I promised I was going to give you each a chance to close. Before I do that, we're going to go to a lightning round question. And we've talked a lot about what the federal government can do, a lot about what the private sector can do, both very important actors. I was in Congress, but I was also a former governor. I'm curious if you guys, and we don't, you don't all have to say Louisiana, that's okay. You can pick other states. I'm just curious, do you see states that are maybe doing some things that other states can learn from? You know, in your experience, are there states out there that are getting this right, that are leading the way on the regulatory, the permitting side and I know that a lot of this depends on federal action, but states have an important role to play here as well, state and local governments. So JC, I'll ask you first, and then Alex, and then after that question, we'll ask give you each a chance to wrap up on our panel. So JC?
Just in the lightning round, Governor, I would say we watch what the northeastern states are doing with relation to offshore wind, and we would see that's a kind of a model for planning early, planning often, consistency. It's just something we've watched with interest and think that that's happening the right way.
That's great. Well, thank you. And hopefully, like I said, there's a potential for wind off the Gulf Coast. So hopefully we can learn from their experience. I know that they're further along than we are, but we'd certainly love to learn from their experiences, and hopefully projects here can move even more quickly. Alex, your thoughts about states you see that are doing things the right way, or the states we should look to as potential models?
Yeah, I think there's a number of states out there who are doing great creative things. I look at Virginia and getting regulatory certainty on offshore wind and how they're going to get that built. I think North Carolina is in the process now of crafting legislation that can do similar things, which would be extremely important. And I think Florida has taken a real measured approach and put in solar, probably the most solar that's gone in of any state in the last couple of years, that in North Carolina. And so I think there are models out there that we can follow.
Alex, I think that was very, I know you're not a politician. I thought that was very smart, hitting many of the states that Duke Energy is focused on. So I wouldn't expect anything less from a senior representative of Duke Energy. Look, I want to give each of our panelists a chance to give their closing and final thoughts. We have literally just about a minute left. So let me let each of you share any last thoughts with our audience out there. JC?
I would just say, first, thank you. And one, we're excited about the opportunity that the future presents itself in clean energy. I think the challenge is great, as we've all identified, but I think so is the opportunity. And I'm grateful for partners and institutions like Bipartisan Policy Center that are shining a light on this and helping us amplify the message of the importance of clean energy and some of the things we can do to advance that and speed the deployment up.
Well, thank you. And Alex, I'll give you the same chance.
Yes, Governor, I would say I think it's going to be critical that we find some politically achievable ways of not only streamlining the federal permitting process, but also that's got to not compromise any stakeholder input and environment.
I think Alex is frozen again. Well, I want to thank Alex and JC both for participating. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this at a time when our politics are more polarized than ever before. Jason and his team do a great job bringing folks together across the partisan aisle to talk public sector and private sector, to talk about real specific solutions. And I want to thank our audience as well for paying attention to what I think is an incredibly important topic. As I started at the top saying, it takes us too long and it's too expensive for us to build infrastructure in this country. And we've got to fix that, especially when it comes to clean energy and clean infrastructure. With that, I'll turn things back to Jason. Thank you again to our panelists.
Just want to thank everybody for joining us and hope you all have a terrific afternoon. Governor, JC, Alex, appreciate it. Thank you.